as it meets to consider a bill to improve forest management activities amid ongoing wildfires in Southern California. Also on the agenda, legislation to detain migrants charged with theft-related crimes. You're watching live coverage on C-SPAN 3.
Good afternoon. The committee will come to order. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare recess at any time. Today, the Rules Committee is convening to consider two important pieces of legislation. H.R. 471, the Fix Our Forest Act, S5, the Laken Riley Act. First, the Fix Our Forest Act is a piece of bipartisan legislation that addresses restoring forest health, bolstering resiliency to devastating wildfires, and protecting at-risk communities. When the House considered the bill months back in the 118th Congress, many bipartisan member ideas were incorporated, and that same bipartisan nature is still present today. I believe we have all seen the devastation caused by the wildfires in California as of late. The footage that has been broadcasted on TV and reflected within print media has been nothing short of harrowing. H.R. 471 offers us the opportunity to lead the way with common sense solutions to strengthen forest management and stewardship in 2025 and beyond. S5, the Laken Riley Act, is the Senate companion legislation to H.R. 29 that the House passed on January 8th of this year. On January 8th, we saw bipartisan support for the House version of the Laken Riley Act, and I expect that we'll see the same result this go-round as well. This legislation would require immigration and customs enforcement to detain illegal aliens who commit crimes related to either theft, assaults on law enforcement officers, or other violent crimes resulting in death or serious bodily harm. Immigration and customs enforcement would utilize the existing definitions of these acts in the criminal codes of the state or local jurisdiction in which they took place. It also allows state attorneys general to sue the Secretary of Homeland Security for injunctive relief if immigration actions such as parole, violation of detention requirements, or other policy failures harm that state or its citizens. Again, this is another piece of bipartisan legislation that will make a sizable positive impact, not only for border security, but also for the safety and security of men, women, and families across the nation. I look forward to the open discussion of these two bills, and I now yield to the ranking member, Mr. McGovern, for any comments he wishes to make.
Well, thank you, Madam Chair. And before I begin, I just want to recognize Tom Wickham, the former House parliamentarian who's here, and it's great to see him again. You know, we're here, as you pointed out, to consider two bills. One is the Fix Our Forest Act. And look, the wildfires in California have been absolutely horrible. And, you know, I have talked to many of our California representatives who represent districts in L.A. and around L.A. about their devastation. And it's absolutely horrific. And what these members have been telling me, and with what friends of mine in the area have been telling me, is they need resources. They need us to invest in infrastructure and to invest in relief to help people deal with the immediate crisis. And I look at this bill, and I mean, there are some, I guess maybe some meritorious ideas in it, but what's really frustrating is it doesn't address the problem at hand right now. And I fear it's an attempt to try to divert discussion away from things like climate change and some other issues, and to, again, get us to look someplace else. And meanwhile, not helping any of the people who have been adversely impacted by the wildfires. I think this is it's sad because I think it's a missed opportunity. We have a bill here that, correct me if I'm wrong, didn't go through regular order. And you can tell, I think. Even some of the good ideas in this bill aren't even funded. So, I mean, what's that all about? Passing programs where there's no funding. I mean, that's a press release or a soundbite. And again, I also think we need to seriously all accept the science, and I know science is a dirty word around here, but that climate change is real, and that what we're seeing in California, and by the way, what we're seeing in other states, is something we need to be very much concerned with. Again, I just think this is a missed opportunity. And then secondly is the revised Laken-Riley Act. There's been some revisions made to it, and I'm just curious, how come the Senate gets to revise bills and we don't even get an opportunity to offer amendments? I mean, what makes the Senate so special? Why can they change the text of bills, but here in the House we're told take it or leave it? I don't know whether there's an answer to that question, but I just kind of I point out that we're dealing with this bill again. It's a little bit different from what we passed in the House originally, but it's changed because the senators were able to make changes, and we can't do anything over here. This place is being run again. I said this at the opening of the session. I mean, the Republicans presided over the most closed Congress in history. The only Congress more closed was the previous Congress, and here we are dealing with two more bills that have closed rules. But on the Laken-Riley Act, a dedicated nursing student, talented cross-country runner, and beloved daughter, life was cut short. Laken-Riley's life was cut short. And I'm glad that the man responsible for this is being brought to justice. But under this bill, you can be here legally under programs like DACA or TPS, and you can be arrested for a crime you did not commit and then deported without even a trial. So you don't have to be convicted of what you were accused of in order to be subject to deportation. And I think some of us, if we had an opportunity to be able to amend things, would like to make sure that people had due process in this country. And by the way, I think some of you may have forgotten about DACA. This is a program that applied to people who were brought here through no fault of their own. Their parents brought them here, sometimes when they were infants, when they were only a few months old. And this has been a program that has allowed them to remain in this country lawfully. Now, these kids we're talking about are now in their 30s. Many of them have never, ever been to their home country. All they know is this country. And so people who are being protected under DACA, under this bill, can be arrested for a crime they did not commit and deported. I mean, I don't even know whether my friends have even thought about the implications of the bill that we're talking about here today. And again, I say this with respect, Madam Chair, that is why we need a process here where some of us can offer amendments, and even Republicans can offer amendments, so we can actually improve the bill. I think you would probably have more people saying, okay, I'm more likely to support a bill where I know that the person, especially if you're a DACA recipient, actually committed the crime. But I guess that's too much to ask. Look, I want to secure the border. I want to make sure we have lots of legal immigration. But the Laken-Riley Act is not just about people who are here illegally. It expands government's power to go after people who didn't even commit the crimes they were accused of, who are protected under TPS or DACA. I mean, what a terrible idea. And if this is implemented the way it's written, I'm going to tell you, we're going to read story after story of injustice and of cruelty. Again, I think we should have a strong, just, and welcoming immigration system. This bill does not do that. In fact, it does the opposite. And in my opinion, sadly, it exploits Riley's tragic death to pass a bad bill. And I'm hoping that maybe, rather than exploit every tragedy, that maybe we get serious about passing legislation that is well thought out, that has gone through regular order, where people have an opportunity to improve it, again, I still don't have an answer to my question is, like, what's so special about the Senate? They can do things like improve bills, but we can't do that here because I'm told this will be brought up under a closed rule. But anyway, with that, I will end my opening statement and yield back to the distinguished chairwoman.
Thank you, Mr. McGovern. I had a bill taken last session by a senator too, so I share a little bit of your frustration in that I had a wonderful bill I'd worked on, and it suddenly came back with a Senate number on it. But
well, this was a lousy bill to begin with. I'm just simply saying we could have made it better in the House before we sent it to the Senate.
well, thank you very much. Without objection, any prepared statements that our witnesses may have will be included in the record. I'd like to welcome our first panel, Chairman Westerman and Ranking Member Huffman from the Committee on Natural Resources. Chairman Westerman, I welcome your testimony.
Thank you, Chair Fox, and good afternoon. It's such an honor to be here with you today. I don't think any of us can say we haven't been disappointed by the Senate. If you haven't been disappointed by the Senate, then you probably haven't been in the House very long. But we have an opportunity to do better today.
I'm not disappointed with the Senate. I'm just disappointed with us. I just want us to be able to do what the Senate can do. That's all.
And we'll be able to do good stuff here today, good bipartisan work. Chairwoman Fox, congratulations to you. I can tell you it's an honor to get to be here on the first panel under the first hearing with you leading the committee. I know you've got much important work to be done in this Congress, and the opportunity to get to present the first rule bill of the year is pretty neat, actually. And there are a few topics that are more urgent for the House to take up than the catastrophic wildfire that the Fix Our Forest Act addresses. I want to begin by saying once again that our prayers are with the people of California right now as they battle fires that have delivered unthinkable devastation. We got updated numbers today. These fires have claimed the lives of 28 people. They've destroyed over 15,000 structures, and the estimated damages right now are $250 billion. Let that sink in, $250 billion of damage. But today we have a unique opportunity. We have an opportunity, as we say, to put feet to our prayers. We need to continue lifting up people in our prayers, but we need to do something different. And unlike hurricanes, tornadoes, and other natural disasters, proper forest management can prevent wildfires. We really can save a pound of cure by investing a penny of prevention. And the Fix Our Forest Act is a comprehensive, bipartisan package that offers real solutions that will help prevent future catastrophic wildfires like the ones affecting Southern California. FOFA uses state-of-the-art science to identify the top 20% of fire sheds and prioritize treatments near communities at high risk of fires that could threaten lives and property. The emergency actions occurring now in Los Angeles, like clearing brush and cutting fuel breaks, are the same treatments that would take place under this legislation. The bill ensures land managers do the work when the sky is blue, not when it's orange and fire is on the doorstep. FOFA codifies emergency authorities used by both Democrat and Republican administrations to increase the pace and scale of management. Without these tools, completing a single forest management project takes 3 to 5 years. With them, land managers can act immediately. FOFA also expands existing categorical exclusions to meet the scale of the crisis. For example, if agencies wanted to treat an area roughly the size of the Palisades fire, they would need 8 separate CEs. Under FOFA, they would only need 2. FOFA doesn't waive a single environmental law. Let me repeat that. It does not waive a single environmental law. We're just making existing tools more flexible and efficient so the work that needs to be done can actually happen. FOFA also contains several provisions to clear flammable vegetation and hazard trees and utility rights-of-way. And that was what we believe was the cause of the fire that have devastated communities like Lahaina and in Paradise, California. And we also have reports that this could have started one of the fires in Southern California. Additionally, FOFA creates a new interagency community wildfire risk reduction program to streamline fragmented federal programs and standardize applications for existing community wildfire defense grants, making it easier for communities to access the assistance that they need. FOFA also encourages technological innovations in wildland firefighting so we can detect fires faster and put them out before they spread to communities. Finally, we've added new provisions to standardize repayment timelines between local fire departments and the federal government to support the local first responders who battle fires that cross jurisdictional boundaries alongside federal firefighters. We know what needs to be done. And make no mistake, there is a price for continued inaction. Since FOFA passed the House on September 24th of last year, an additional 1.5 million acres have burned across the United States. We don't have the luxury of sitting around and doing nothing any longer. My good friend from California, Representative Scott Peters, and I have negotiated this legislation in good faith for more than a year, continually incorporating ideas from members on both sides of the aisle. We added several Democrat amendments during a Natural Resources Committee markup last year where the bill passed by voice vote. On the floor, we accepted Republican and Democrat amendments that helped improve the bill. Forest management should not be a partisan issue, and last year this bill passed the House with overwhelming bipartisan support. This year we have 17 Democrat co-sponsors on the bill. I urge the committee to report an appropriate rule so that the Fix Our Forest Act can be considered in the House. Thank you, Madam Chair, and I yield back.
Thank you, Madam Chair, Ranking Member McGovern, and members of the committee. It is an honor to lead the first rules bill in the 119th Congress. Our committee on natural resources is not yet even organized, but here we are with a 100-plus page bill going straight to the floor, a bill that we could have made better if we had the chance to debate and consider some amendments. Now, clearly, my Republican colleagues are attempting to seize the opportunity of the fires that are still being fought in Los Angeles. And if this was something in this bill that would actually help the people of Los Angeles, it would be welcome. The fires in LA are devastating. 27 people have died. Thousands of structures have been destroyed. Neighborhoods, entire communities are decimated. We have tens of thousands of climate refugees right now in Los Angeles looking for places to stay. But instead of helping these people in their communities, many Republicans have actually been threatening to condition critical disaster relief for the people of Southern California, something Congress has never done. And today we have a bill that seeks to exploit the tragedy of the LA fires to advance the same old tiresome Republican agenda of rolling back environmental laws while ignoring the climate crisis that keeps bringing us record-breaking disasters one after another. I will acknowledge that this bill includes some important measures championed by Democrats to enhance wildfire response. But these good provisions in the bill are undermined and rendered virtually ineffective by the lack of funding. Vulnerable communities' greatest need right now to achieve fire safety and resilience is resources, and this bill doesn't provide any. Instead, it uses fire safety as a pretext to repackage the same old Republican playbook we've seen for years, going after bedrock environmental laws, dramatically limiting public input. This bill does it in the context of forest management, but when the bill passes, and it will, this will surely be used by Republicans as a precedent for gutting environmental reviews on all manner of polluting projects with devastating consequences for disadvantaged communities. Let's talk about the most critical fire safety need right now, aid. In the final days of the Biden-Harris administration, Democrats stepped up to approve desperately needed aid, and there's still a long road ahead, though. Congress must ensure that this aid is actually delivered, just as we have for communities devastated by floods and hurricanes in many of your states. We must work together to help Los Angeles rebuild, not use the tragedy of lost homes, livelihoods, and loved ones to score political points. If Republicans are rushing Fix Our Forests through as a response to this disaster, then please tell me, why does it not do anything to help the victims and the impacted communities right now. They need aid. The bill has no funding for federal land management agencies to do the work of making our forests healthier and more resilient. No funding to help Los Angeles and other frontline communities implement projects to protect against catastrophic wildfire, although it says that it supports these type of projects. It doesn't include the longstanding bipartisan priority of funding for wildland firefighters who are soon going to lose the temporary pay increase we provided under the IIJA. These brave firefighters are battling apocalyptic conditions right now, around the clock. For pennies on the dollar of what they should be paid, they deserve more. Now, for the next major issue with this legislation, the endless scapegoating of environmental laws and attacks on public review and participation. Contrary to the talking points on the other side of the aisle, there's nothing new or innovative to fix our forests here. The GOP has been pushing these industry-requested environmental rollbacks for years. By rolling back NEPA for broadly defined emergency fireshed projects, the bill waives environmental review for a lot more than the good projects that we all support, more than controlled burns, more than vegetation clearing, thinning and clearing. It sweeps in large-scale commercial logging projects, which is really what that part of the bill is all about. Bona fide fire safety projects already can move forward under categorical exemptions, and they are doing so at a record pace. But commercial scale logging is rarely about fire safety. In fact, research shows that harvesting mature trees and clear cutting can actually increase wildfire risk. Another problem is the bill's reckless reduction of Endangered Species Act protections on national forest land, exempting the Forest Service from any requirement to consider new scientific discoveries, new ESA listings, or new critical habitat designations once a forest plan has been approved. This could put some species at greater risk of extinction, and it will surely be used by Republicans to advance sweeping ESA rollbacks in other settings as well. This is all deeply unnecessary. Land management agencies already have a suite of streamlining authorities paired with funding from the IIJA and the IRA to move good projects faster, and that's why we have advanced so many proactive, healthy forest management projects in the past few years. The supposed regulatory obstacles to forest management that my colleagues cite ad nauseum are more often than not caused by an ongoing lack of agency resources and staff, a result of short-sighted Republican budget cuts, not our environmental laws. It is well worth noting that NEPA and ESA, these rollbacks that were being proposed today, were not among the consensus recommendations from the nonpartisan 2023 Wildland Fire Mitigation and Management Commission report. Some other aspects of that report are reflected in the bill, although they're not funded, but these controversial NEPA and ESA rollbacks were not consensus recommendations from that report. These changes would also limit judicial review and rewrite the rules to tilt the scales against communities who go to court looking for help. The bill's draconian NEPA shot clock would crush meaningful public participation and good faith collaboration between the public, federal agencies, and project proponents. And when that process works, it actually makes projects better. It doesn't just delay things. Most glaringly, this bill does nothing to address the climate crisis. The scope and severity of these wildfires is a direct result of climate change. That is a fact. We cannot just bury our heads in the sand and ignore the climate component of this disaster. Democrats on the Natural Resources Committee and across the caucus are committed to actual, innovative, and effective responses to the growing wildfire crisis. Investments secured by House Democrats enabled the Biden administration to achieve record acres of hazardous fuel reduction and prescribed fire projects through the wildfire crisis strategy. These investments are working, but they have an end date. We need to come together to double down on this success and ensure land management agencies continue to have the resources they need. Democrats are ready, and we have real solutions to address the wildfire crisis. In fact, I just introduced with my Republican colleague, Mr. Obernolte, the Wildfire Protection and Community Resilience Act to help local communities defend themselves from the growing danger of wildfire. This bipartisan bill empowers communities to implement We don't just support it with lip service. We give them what they need to implement science-based wildfire mitigation methods, providing funding to design and implement new community protection and wildfire resilience plans with community members, first responders, and relevant state agencies. Also establishes a targeted FEMA grant program for home hardening and makes it eligible for funding under existing U.S. Forest Service programs. Devastating fires aren't just a problem in our forests. The LA fires make it clear that we have to focus on and prepare for fires in cities and towns all over the country. I was optimistic that this bill might improve with several amendments that Democrats filed to address some of the actual and most pressing needs. First and foremost, that includes ensuring fair wages for federal wildland firefighters, something this bill again woefully lacks. But in another disappointing turn, I understand this bill will be considered under a closed rule with zero opportunity to consider or vote on any amendments. Under the eyes of the majority, the bill is already perfect and will completely fix our forests when it is far from that. This is a real missed opportunity. We can do so much more to meet this moment, and I will keep working to ensure that those priorities are addressed in this Congress. I yield back.
Thank you very much, Mr. Huffman. We are not imposing any kind of time frame in the Rules Committee at this time. I will note that you spoke for about a little over 9 minutes, and Mr. Westerman just a little over 5 minutes, I believe. So we're going to encourage people to submit their written testimony and hold their comments to a minimum. Chairman Westerman, I want to thank you for reintroducing this legislation, and I also want to thank you for your dedication to bringing forward a thoughtful bipartisan package. I understand countless hours were spent with Representative Peters and many others in crafting the product before the committee today. It's a testament to the good work of the Natural Resources Committee that this bill can be considered under the first rule of the 119th Congress. Mr. Chairman, can you please expound upon why it is so important this legislation be signed into law quickly?
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I will answer that with a two-part answer. Number one, the stakes are extremely high, and number two is what we're doing is not working. And when I say the stakes are high, we're looking at this devastating fire in Southern California where 15,000 homes and 28 lives and $250 billion have gone up in smoke. But if you look at what we define as the wildland-urban interface, that's where homes and the wildlands interface with each other. There are 44 million homes in our country in the wildland-urban interface. Now, 15,000 homes lost is unimaginable, but there are 44 million other homes that are at the same risk as the homes that are in Los Angeles. That's very, very high stakes. And what we're doing is not working. It simply is not working. As I mentioned earlier, we passed this bill last fall, and there's been 1.5 million acres burned since we passed the bill, and the Senate failed to take it up. I know it's been mentioned that what we need is more money thrown at the problem. But look at what happened in not the last Congress, but the one before. There was $12 billion sent to the Forest Service and our land management agencies, and the amount of acres treated went down. So we threw money at it, and the problem didn't go away. Actually, it got worse. So there's got to be something else other than money. And the problem is we can't manage the land. And what this bill does, and again, I thank Representative Peters for all of his work on it, is it allows land managers to do their job. And we know how to address these issues, but you've got to put feet to those actions, and that's what the Fix Our Forest Act does. So that's why it's so important.
I think you've pointed out a problem that exists across our federal government. I understand 471 has some modifications from H.R. 8790, the bill that passed last Congress, including the addition of H.R. 3396, the Fire Department Repayment Act of 2023, which passed last Congress. Can you explain how these changes complement the overarching goal of the legislation?
Again, we want this legislation to be bipartisan. We want it to be effective, and we've been open to many ideas, and we took many amendments on both sides of the aisle to create the text that we have today. This amendment that just requires the federal government to pay local firefighting officials the money that they're owed when they go in and fight these fires, it's common sense. It's hard to imagine that there are local firefighting entities, tribal, county, state, city, that go in and fight the fire, and then a year later they haven't been reimbursed by the Forest Service. So this was bipartisan, common sense legislation to include in the bill.
Thank you. I'm going to ask one more question since California, the California situation has come up. There's a lot of discussion about whether this legislation could have helped the situation in California. I think the bill would have helped and could provide future assistance. Could you point to some specifics in the bill that would have aided in the prevention of, response to, and recovery from these fires in California?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Really, it's the provisions to do work in the wildland-urban interface, provisions to do work on right-of-ways, and the ability to actually do the work in a timely manner. You know, there's a saying about planting a tree. The best time to have planted a tree was many years ago. The next best time is today. When we want to look at keeping forests healthy, a lot of this should have been put in place many years ago, decades ago. But until we start actually doing the work on the ground, the situation is not going to get better.
Thank you very much. Mr. McGovern.
Yeah, well, I was just told my opening was close to 9 minutes long, too. So in the interest of moving this hearing forward, I'm going to yield back. But before I yield back my time, I mean, I'm just looking at some of the amendments. I mean, for example, there's an amendment here that Mr. Neguse has that would improve pay and benefits for federal wildland firefighters. I would hope that some of these amendments like that could be made in order, because we've been watching the terrible ordeal in California, and these brave men and women who are fighting these fires deserve better. So, but anyway, I will yield back my time because I don't want to be admonished by the chair.
Madam Chair?
Yeah.
Certainly.
So I agree. And the reason that amendment wasn't made in order, we've already provided the additional funding for firefighters in the appropriations bill that I voted for and a lot of others in this room voted for.
Well, I'll yield to Mr. Huffman.
Yeah, Mr. Ranking Member, that funding is in limbo. We're operating under a CR because of Republican politics. So the long-term security of that funding is totally unresolved. Could have been in this bill, but right now we have a few more weeks.
I think if we want to help these firefighters, we would make this amendment in order. But I yield back. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. McGovern. Mr. Norman, you're recognized.
Thank both of you for testifying. Mr. Congressman Westerman, would any of this had an impact in California, in your opinion?
I mean, had it been implemented years ago and the work had been done, it absolutely would have had an effect. And I don't want to create the wrong idea of the severity of these fires. I've been in this area. I've flown over in a helicopter, and what we think of as traditional forest is not really what you see in Southern California. You got a lot of chaparral and scrub brush, and it's in very steep canyons. It's in very arid conditions. You get these strong winds, and it's amazing you can put these fires out. But what this bill would have allowed to have happened was to create defensible zones so that firefighters and emergency personnel could have gone in and had a chance to stop the fire before it got into the neighborhoods. You know, once these fires get into the homes become the forest fire. I mean, they're obviously homes, but they're the fuel for the fire. So your best option is to be able to stop the fire before it gets into the neighborhoods and starts burning homes. And had these provisions in the bill been implemented years ago, we would have seen good results. Now, we've passed forestry management legislation. A great example is up in South Lake Tahoe. It's a totally different kind of forest, but Representative McClintock got language passed. They went in and did the management, and almost like clockwork, the management was done. A huge fire came through, and that management probably saved South Lake Tahoe. There was another region just up from there where the management activities got held up in permitting and in the courts, and the fire came through and took the whole community out. So we know this works. We've seen it in practice, and there's numerous examples we can point to. The Paradise Fire, or the Camp Fire in Paradise, where it was actually put out was on an area where fire breaks had been created. It was on private land, unfortunately. It wasn't on the federal land, but we can do this on federal land, and it's good forest management. You know, we hear talk about endangered species. Well, when one of these fires go through, it kills all the species and drives them off the land and makes the habitat such that they can't come back for a long time.
Well, with the restrictions California has, I don't think you could implement any of these things, could you? But how do you get past the regulations that California has passed that doesn't, I mean,
we're talking about federal land, so you could do the management on federal land.
Right.
Now, what the state of California does on their state lands and the restrictions they put on their private landowners, that's really not our jurisdiction here. But what we're looking at are the federal lands and how to make these federal lands more resilient, and especially where they interface with the urban areas in that wildland-urban interface.
In California, how much of the fire was on federal land versus private?
I don't have the exact acreage yet. I believe it was the Eaton fire was mostly in the Angeles National Forest. I can get that information for you.
Well, a fifth of the billion acres under forest, under federal government management, a fifth of it's at risk of fires like I think what happened in California. But I haven't seen.
It's probably actually higher than that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mr. Tuffin, you mentioned conditions. What conditions are you saying is not right?
Well, I hope there won't be any conditions. I'm talking about the federal disaster relief that California will be needing. I'm hearing, tens of billions of dollars. There has been a lot of media reporting of some of my colleagues across the aisle suggesting that that should be conditioned, not something we've done for other states, but I mentioned it because there's a lot of concern right now that may be done for the first time ever.
Where's the money coming from?
FEMA.
FEMA. Where's FEMA getting the money?
From the taxpayers.
Okay.
All of us.
More
fellow
debt.
Americans having each other's back.
Well, when you have policies like California has, and my son-in-law was with an insurance company, that basically when California passed Proposition 103 that set rates, when California had policies that set the rates that premiums that insurance companies could charge, whereas below their cost, guess what they did? They left. And as bad as it is, a lot of the victims had their houses burned. The insurance company simply could not, that's called federal overreach, which this Biden administration was famous for. And I guess, how do you answer having no water in the fire hydrants to protect the smell of fish? How do you answer having no water in the reservoirs?
I'm glad you asked that.
Pardon me?
I'm glad you asked that, Representative, because that is one of the unfortunate persistent falsehoods that we've heard. Reservoirs are at very high levels right now.
So that's a lie?
It is not a lie. There's an entirely new fact debunking site on the state of California's website now to confront this stuff that's swirling around. This is one of it. The Delta smelt had nothing to do with the fact that some of the local water systems ran out of water. People need to understand how firefighting works and how local tanks are refilled and what happens when you have the kind of demands all at once throughout an entire community like the Palisades. Yeah, tanks are run down and they can't be replenished in time to keep fire in the hydrants and in the lines. That doesn't mean that the Delta smelt caused that problem. That means an incredible surge in demand to fight fires overtaxed the system, and that would happen in any community in America.
So how does that, with conditions you mentioned, you had a mayor who cut the funding, $17 million. How does that rank with your wanting money from the federal government when you have all of this?
Yeah.
And I've had activists come to my office. I said, what about the thatch? We own forest land. We thin it. You can't thin in California.
We do. And we are.
Let me just finish. I will let you, I'm not filibustering. I'll just tell you the facts as we have them. In California, if you let the thatch get that high, you've got a tinderbox. You can't do anything about it. And as one activist told me, I asked her a very simple question. Do trees have lives? What do you mean? She said, and I said, no, do they die and need to be cleared and cut out? No, the carbon footprint will not be, we can't do that. All I'm saying is California needs to take some ownership into what happened, as serious as it is. And the difference in what Helene did versus what California did with the regulations, with their inability to cut any trees, to ask the federal government for money with no conditions, it's like going to a bank and not putting up any collateral. It doesn't happen, or it shouldn't happen. That bank will go broke. That's why this country's going broke, with liberal policies that Gavin Newsom and Miss Bass, who I serve with. But cutting funding for firemen and then wanting pay increases? I don't understand. I'll let you respond.
Well, Congressman, I think some of what you're saying is going to break the fact-check machine, and I will, if you'll allow, get you separately an entire debunking sheet that walks through several of the things that you've just said and shows that they are not true. We do all kinds of forest treatment in California. In fact, the state has put new streamlining authorities, massive funding into this. Right now, state and federal and local partners and tribal partners are treating absolutely as much land as they can on strained budgets. What's holding back the opportunity to do even more are some of these stubborn budget cuts that we've seen here in Congress, not the Endangered Species Act, not the Delta smelt, not any of these other red herrings that we continue to hear about.
Was the $17 million cut from a fire department real or not real?
In the city of Los Angeles?
Wherever Mayor Bass cut it, is that a fact?
I am not aware of the city's budget, but I will look into it. And, you know, I don't know what has happened in North Carolina and in the Gulf Coast in the wake of some of these hurricanes. I didn't ask whether those local governments cut their budgets. I provided their disaster relief because I think we all should have each other's back in the face of natural disasters. I think this is raw politics.
Well, the only politics, you would think, I think Mr. McGovern was talking about using science. It's political science has been used in California. And I resent conditions ought to be placed on, California's going to have to help itself before we turn money over that we don't have. We're borrowing money to pay the light bill.
And you're prepared for us to apply that same standard to the victims of hurricanes and derechos in the Midwest?
Here's the difference. And take Helena. That took out, and Virginia Fox knows this, that was a hurricane not from the neglect of the people in North Carolina. It took out complete roads. It took out the flooding. That wasn't a product of worthless legislation that the government put on North Carolinians. And the $710 that the past administration gave was a teardrop in the ocean. And I resent when he came. All Biden wanted to do was a photo op in Greenville. It's a joke, and until y'all take ownership in California to get things back to what this is trying to do, and this wouldn't help California because it would never get passed. It's 250. I think in California to get a regulation changed is 253 days. But I know in the one case when you got government regulating insurance companies, and that's why they're not getting. They are victims, but they did it. They allowed this type of insanity to exist. So
We have a nationwide insurance crisis because of climate change, and we're going to be talking about it a lot, I'm sure, in the months and years ahead. But I would just say, sir, that when we approved funding to rebuild roads and bridges wiped out by that hurricane in North Carolina, we weren't parsing local budgets to see how they were funding their roads and their bridge maintenance. We had our fellow Americans back in a moment of tragedy. I would hope that my fellow members of Congress would do the same for the people of Los Angeles.
Well, I'll fight anything that doesn't have conditions. And again, this is money we don't have. And to continue this type of, no strings attached, the federal government did not allow the forest lands to get in the condition they did. And what Congressman Westman has, they would never do in California because they don't. You've got environmentalists who run.
They do it all the time. I can take you to my district and show you the shaded fuel breaks and the fire breaks and the forest treatments and the controlled burns that have been happening at record level. Look, you're entitled to your opinion, sir, but not your own facts.
Get me the facts that I'm wrong, and let's come back to this committee. Yeah. And if it's wrong what Karen Bass did, if it's wrong that you could take trees out, you can do burn pits among the forest lands. It was 60, I think it was 60 back, I don't know, back when this country was settled, it was 64 trees per acre, and now it's 300 in California. No wonder they're starting fires. Anyway, I've taken enough time, but I would love to see the facts. Show me where I'm wrong.
Thank you.
And show me how anything here could be implemented in California.
You bet.
I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Norman. Ms. Scanlon, you're recognized.
Thank you, Chairwoman. Yeah, I mean, a lot of us have been following the fires. Some of us have kids who've recently moved to LA and lived across the street from an evacuation area. So it's been top of mind, top of the news, of course, for weeks. We're seeing these increasingly destructive weather events across the country. We now have tornadoes in southeastern Pennsylvania, something that didn't happen previously, as well as increased flooding, et cetera. So there's a lot we need to work on here. I'm encouraged that Natural Resources has been able to work together to come up with some solutions. Now, you did mention something about having local input into these regulations. I think there is concern that D.C. is going to be dictating what local conditions should be addressed, whether in terms of this bill or in terms of what conditions have to be met. I mean, if D.C. is going to dictate conditions to California, maybe it should dictate conditions to North Carolina and say you can't rebuild in the flooding areas along the coast. So what can you tell us about the need for local input here?
Thank you for that question. This is one provision in the bill that just goes too far. It shortens the statute of limitation and dramatically constrains public input. Right now, the standard is 6 years. You could argue that that's too long. This takes it down to 120 days, but nothing like that in any NEPA review process. And what it's going to do is prevent the system from working the way it should, where local communities and stakeholders and others receive notice of a project and then work with the project proponents and the federal agencies to make sure it's in the right place and doing the right thing, and it makes projects better. When you cut out any opportunity to do that, and you do it in the name of getting rid of frivolous litigation, you encourage the frivolous litigators to just quickly file. Instead of trying to work out problems on projects, you probably produce more litigation, but you undermine the integrity of the system to work the way it should.
Yeah, I mean, we have a lot of concerns in my region about making sure that, obviously, nobody wants things hung up with red tape, but we also want to make sure that when these projects move forward, that they're doing so in a way that's not going to harm members of the community. I had to kind of chuckle as you say 120 days. Anyone who's ever tried to get public comment on something knows that 120 days, all you're going to get at that point is people saying, wait, you didn't tell me this was happening. So I do appreciate your efforts on this, and as several people have mentioned now, have to really strongly object to the idea that we would be conditioning disaster aid upon some kind of micromanagement of state and local conditions. So thank you. I yield back.
Can I address
Thank
that,
you,
Madam
Ms.
Chair?
Scanlon. Certainly.
So I think this illustrates just what the problem is. Right now you have 6 years, not for public comment, but to sue on the public comments after the comments are made. This bill says you've got 4 months. So you get your comment period, and then you've got 4 months to challenge what came out in the comment period. That seems like an exceptionally long amount of time to be able to challenge something, not to carry it out 6 years into, I mean, think about if you wanted to do management on a project and you're waiting 6 years to get approval to do it. Think of the cost, just the fiscal cost, but also the cost that can be incurred in forest health and catastrophic wildfires.
Thanks for clarifying that. Mr. Langworthy, you're recognized.
Well, thank you very much, Chairwoman Fox. Chairman Westerman, it is no surprise to anyone, least of to you, that the radical environmental groups who claim to care about forest management, that they have time and again criticized this bill and this legislation. Similar to what we've heard from our colleagues on the other side of the dais today, these groups have claimed that the Fix Our Forests Act, quote, stifles citizen voices and, quote, removes the science from land management decisions. Let me ask you this, Chairman Westerman. Is limiting frivolous legislation and litigation by these same groups who hold up the management of our forests for years and years really stifling citizens' voices?
Well, it's stifling citizens' ability to live in safety in these wildland-urban interfaces. And again, this bill has 17 Democrat co-sponsors. We had 55 Democrats vote for the bill in the House last year. And I think people are seeing on both sides of the aisle that what we're doing isn't working. You know, the definition of insanity is to continue doing what's not working and expecting to get different results. The Fix Our Forest Act is a new approach that protects the environmental review process, but it streamlines it so it can happen in a reasonable time frame.
And the bipartisan co-sponsors of this legislation, I mean, you know, did they come from all over the country, or are they one particular area?
They're from all over the country, but there are a lot of California Democrats who are co-sponsoring the bill. And again, Scott Peters from Southern California has been an excellent partner in drafting this bill. You know, Scott's background's an environmental lawyer, and he's worked in very good faith and as a partner to come up with not only this bill, but we've worked on other bills on saving the sequoias. And now's the time to do something different. We can't continue doing what's not been working.
Well, I appreciate your insight here today, Mr. Chairman, and I do agree with the gentleman from California. I mean, we need to support our neighbors in their time of need, and there's been tremendous loss in the state of California. Every one of our states suffers natural disasters from time to time. But we do need to have world-class standards of forest management across the country, and I think this is a step in the right direction towards that, and I really salute the committee for taking that on. Forest management needs to adheres to the science. This should not be a partisan issue. If we are going to protect lives, protect communities, and preserve our nation's forests for future generations, my colleagues on the other side of the aisle need to abandon a mindless zeal that results in nothing more than locking away federal lands forever and ever and allowing our national treasures like those in the majesty of America's West to burn year after year. I appreciate your leadership on this, Mr. Chairman, and with that, I yield back, Madam Chair.
Mr. Westerman, you want to add?
I just wanted to kind of go off of something Representative Langworthy said. This bill could be passed out of the House, passed out of the Senate, and signed into law before FEMA ever even comes up with the estimate on what the disaster relief package is. We passed this bill out of the House, again, on a bipartisan basis, long before the fires in California even started. So this bill is about forest management, and it would be great to do something positive before FEMA even came up with the estimates on what the disaster relief number should be.
Thank you, Mr. Westerman. Ms. Leisure-Fernandez, you're recognized for your questions.
For my questions, right? You're so used to saying for 5 minutes, right? So I don't think we'll take that much time, hopefully. But I want to join others, and thank you, Mr. Langworthy. I want to thank you because you noted, I believe, in listening to you, that there is a difference and a separation between responding to a disaster and what this bill is trying to do, and that we need to keep those separate. And I want to join those who are recognizing how hard it is in California right now with the suffering that is going on. And I do hope that we can stand united with them in their grief and their loss, because those fires that are raging in California, you know, they might be raging in Utah, in Wyoming, in Montana in the near future. And we need to remember Americans do not turn their backs on Americans when disasters hit. You know, when Democrats were in charge, we never talked about restricting access to disaster aid based on whether there was a Democrat or Republican as the elected leaders. We responded to the idea of disasters like Americans do with help. And it's a helping hand. It doesn't completely bail you out. I know, because we've had those disasters in my district, and I am hopeful that Republicans would not start such a precedent of giving out aid based on a state's voting record, because we didn't do it for North Carolina. We did not do it for South Carolina, Florida, or Georgia. And I know that we will respond to California like we will. But Chairman Westerman, going to this bill, I said it last time you were here in our committee, I do appreciate the work that has gone into this. Not every provision, but I do appreciate the hard work you've done on it. And I've spoken to you about my community's objections to restricting community impact precisely because the Forest Service burned almost 250,000 acres when they didn't get enough community input. So my district is saying, you can't do that, right? And I've shared that with you. Through NEPA, I will tell you that we do have forest management going on. We do have prescribed burns going on in my district. We do have thinning projects, some very innovative stuff going on. I'd love for you to come visit my district and see that work. But it is through that community input that we're rebuilding the trust. And so I have to listen to my constituents in that. I want to talk a bit about reseedling. And you know I'm passionate about this. There's about an average of 7 million acres burning each year. The bill addresses reseedling, but it's really hard to keep up. We are not growing enough baby trees, right? And you know that I have an amendment to the bill that would expand seedling production by allowing seedlings, nurseries run by nonprofits, run by universities and states, because they, for some reason, weren't included in the bipartisan infrastructure bill. So would you agree that we need to expand seedling production and how we might do that?
Yeah, we need to concentrate on what is called regeneration, whether you plant seedlings or where you sprout new trees from seeds. What's happening in a lot of these fires, and I'll use the Angora fire, that I visited that site 12 years after the fire, and they had replanted it 6 times. And the trees hadn't taken hold because there's so much fuel load on the land that when these fires get so hot that a lot of times they're burning the organic matter out of the soil. So you've got not only a denuded landscape, but you've got a sterilized soil. And when you plant seedlings in it, there's no nutrients to allow the seedlings to grow. Fire is a natural part of the landscape, and a lot of species actually need fire to regenerate or reproduce. And trees were reproducing the old-fashioned way before we started containerizing seedlings, by just the land being cleared by fire and the seeds falling down on the soil and sprouting and taking up. So I think we definitely need more seed tree nurseries so that we can have more seedlings to plant, but we also need to manage the forest in a way where it can be the lowest cost, maybe the most effective way to reproduce trees is through seeds dropping from the
that would be lovely if we could do that. We call it, in New Mexico, we re-celebrate the collection of seeds. In fact, our famous pinon falls like manna from heaven when we go and collect it. We leave enough so the pinon trees can grow back. But we do know we have to have more nurseries. And my bill was passed by unanimous consent. I have it as an amendment, and unfortunately, since we're not allowing amendments, even when a bill was passed by unanimous, passed out of committee, we're not allowing amendments of bills that are bipartisan and supported. So I'd hope that you will work with me on seeing if we can have my bill come into law in some other way.
Thank you.
Is that a yes?
I worked with you in the committee, so I'll continue working with you on it.
Thank you. I do appreciate that, Mr. Chair. And Ranking Member Huffman, I'm the last Democrat on here, so I always get to ask the Ranking Member, what else do you want to speak to? Because it is a friendly questioner here. But I would like, Madam Chair, I'd like to ask unanimous consent to enter into the record the article Conspiracies Are Rife About Water and the LA Fires. Here's what experts say.
Without objection.
And in response to some of the issues about whether there was enough water, some of what the experts are saying is, one, that fires in California have grown more explosive because of climate change, but that with regards to the water, that these so many fires exploding at one time is that you had infrastructure that was designed to fight a house fire here, some fires there, and not the kind of biblical. I think this is what it says. We have infrastructure that is not made to fight cataclysmic fires, biblical-sized fires. And with regards to the water, the LA's Metropolitan Water District Board, the ones who should know, the experts, said, and I quote, "I can say with great authority, we have as much water stored as any time in the history of our agency," close quote. So this issue about, was California, Northern California hoarding all the water, I think has been laid to rest by the fact that those reservoirs, there was a reservoir that was out of service because of repairs and work on it, right? You want to take care of your reservoirs. But do you want to add anything else to some of the comments that have been made today?
No, I appreciate that, and you're absolutely right. Southern California reservoirs are full. I was asked earlier about several of these things that have had to be debunked, frankly, over and over again, and I referenced that the governor has put together a debunking site. I have that now, what the governor has. It spoke to several of the things that my colleague brought up. Explains that the budget in California for forest treatment is literally 10 times bigger than when Governor Newsom took office. It's gone from $200 million to $2 billion during that time. It explains that the Delta smelt had nothing to do with this, that the water reservoirs in Southern California are at record levels on point after point. There's just a bunch of stubborn misinformation that is not helping the people of Los Angeles and is really just distracting all of us from the things that we really need to come together and help them in this moment. So I would like to enter this into the record, if I could, Madam Chairman.
Without objection.
Yeah, thank you. And lastly, to my colleague's question, if you really want to point to the one thing that drove the scale of this crisis, it is the hurricane force winds that grounded air tankers, that drove these embers over vast distances in ways that completely overpowered even the best firefighting response. So that's something that's happening more and more, and we know why. We know that climate change is increasing the severity of these events, and at some point, in addition to the triage of dealing with the damage from these disasters, we are going to have to stop making them worse by worsening human-caused climate change. Appreciate the question.
And I think that this concept of 100-mile-per-hour winds, right? I mean, that's hurricane force, right? And my colleagues on the dais, they suffered that. They lived through that. Now, their hurricane force winds were part of a hurricane and came with flooding and water. And in this instance, there wasn't those winds, those 100-mile-per-hour winds were not bringing water, but they were bringing embers. I just can't imagine, what it must feel like to be there. And this concept of Americans coming together in times of need and being unified in responding is something I've always been very proud of who we are as Americans, that's what we do. We have each other's backs. We take care of each other. We don't start the blame. Yes, we must look at reasons. We must carefully look at those issues, look at legislation that might be useful. But in that time of need, we show up and we reach out our hands.
It's one of the last spaces where we're not partisan, where we're just fellow Americans. And it would be really sad and tragic if we lost even that to the partisan politics of the day.
Well, I'm hopeful that we won't. And because as one of my dear friends calls, I think we all should be radical optimists. Anything else? If not, with that, I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Lozier-Fernandez. Mr. Scott, you're recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'll try to be pretty quick with this, but I would just remind everybody, sometimes disaster aid is conditions-based. Farmers who receive a disaster payment are required to purchase crop insurance over the next several years. And so we do have conditions on disaster aid in certain circumstances. It's not, so let's not pretend that we've never conditioned disaster aid. I'm going to try to stick to the 5 minutes. So I'm just, I hope we do get the disaster done. That was my district that was hit by the hurricane. And I will tell you, I've been supportive of requiring farmers to purchase the crop insurance after they receive disaster. So sometimes it is condition based is my only point. But I mean, whether the smelt is or isn't responsible, I guess we could debate. But the fact of the matter is the Endangered Species Act has been abused. And now you've got people going in, and on the longfin smelt, it's not that it is endangered. Now they're going into area specifics. So even though the longfin's not endangered, they're getting the San Francisco Bay geographical area of the longfin smelt classified as an endangered species, if I'm not correct. Is that right?
I have no idea, but...
Okay, well, according to the fisheries site, it is. And if you want to talk about the politics of it, if you look at what Fish and Wildlife issued on January the 14th, right before Trump became president, they proposed making vast swaths of the area over this other smelt a protected area. So the abuses of the Endangered Species Act are there, and they do create problems with getting the forest lands cleaned up, whether it's the smelt or other abuses of the Endangered Species Act. And so I candidly, I think it would be reasonable to correct some of the abuses in the Endangered Species Act in the disaster package. But we need to get these forest lands cleaned up. We need to stop all of the frivolous litigation in this country. Not just at the federal level, but at the state level. And with that, Madam Chair, I'm going to turn it back over to you and yield the remainder of my time.
Well, thank you very much. You win today's prize. Mr. Griffith, you're recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I would ask Mr. Westerman if he'd help me with my lottery tickets, because if I understood the ranking member correctly, he thought perhaps that you had this bill as a distraction to what was going on in California, and yet this bill is substantially the same as the bill we voted on sometime last year, long before the fire started. Isn't that correct?
That's correct, before the fires in Southern California started.
Right. So if that's the case, then you must be clairvoyant. If this is just a distraction, would you not agree with me that that would be his reasoning?
Well, I can promise you I'm not clairvoyant.
So you can't help me with my lottery tickets. All right.
I can't help you.
I will ask you about this, though. One of the areas that's relatively new, or at least what appeared to me to be new in reading the comparison drafts, is the white oak section. And while I'm not a bourbon drinker, I don't drink at all, but a lot of my friends drink bourbon, and they're very concerned about the white oak because you really can't get a good bourbon without your white oak. Can you address what that section of the bill does?
So we've got an issue that goes back to forest management across the country, and you talk about white oaks and bourbon, and the definition of bourbon says it's whiskey that has been aged in a new white oak barrel. And when we look at our forest inventory across the country where white oak grows, We have a lot of older, mature white oak, but we don't have the young white oak saplings. And so looking out into the future, there could be a great decrease in the amount of white oak available to make white oak barrels. So white oak is obviously famous for making barrels, but it's also fantastic wildlife habitat and provides many benefits to the forest. So the White Oak Act, which is included in the Fix Our Forest Act, is addressing, these are forests in the east mainly, on how we get more white oak for the future.
Yeah, a lot of white oaks in my district, and in reading over that section, it sounded like what we're trying to do is to make sure that there's a natural propagation of the white oak so that we have that asset available not only for wildlife but for those people who do choose to drink bourbon, whether they be in my district or somewhere else. That, Madam Chair, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Griffith. Mr. Jack.
Well, I'm eager to win your prize for the shortest comments today as the freshman in the room. But if I may just start with Chairman Westerman, you noted that 55 Democrats voted for a very similar piece of legislation last Congress. And just to affirm, I know we talked a little bit about the Eaton fire. Is that in the Angeles National Forest?
Correct.
So I just find interesting that one of the members who left the last Congress and is no longer a part of this Congress, but Tony Cardenas, he voted for that legislation last cycle. And I find it interesting that he represents a large chunk of the Angeles National Forest. And I just think for the record, that should be noted that he represents an area that is clearly very directly affected by some of the wildfires we discussed today. The second thing I'd like to ask, and I just note some of the major provisions you walk through on the bill. You talk about a study evaluating locations for a western headquarters of the U.S. Forest Service. Could you expound upon that just a moment?
I think you're referring to the fire sheds, and this is a new way to look at fire. A watershed is the geographic area where everything's going to drain. Well, with modern technology and AI, we can look at forest cover, topography, wind patterns, and establish what's called a fire shed, and we can better predict not only where fires will start, but also the best way to address those fires once they start. And that leads back to another discussion we've had about the severity of the fires in Southern California and the strong winds. And, wind and dry fuel and fire are obviously a terrible recipe, but I was thinking of Mr. Scott, and in his state of Georgia, there's something called the Okefenokee Swamp, which you've probably never heard of the massive fires in the Okefenokee Swamp because it's not residential neighborhoods bordering the Okefenokee, it's private timberland, and these fires start in the swamp, and they're similar to the fires we're seeing in California with very strong winds and dry conditions driving these fires, and the embers travel out a half mile to a mile ahead of the fire. But the private forest landowners whose land adjoins it, they go in and they thin the forest, they remove the ground cover, and it gives them a spot to hopefully put these fires out when they come out of the swamp. It's a totally different topography, totally different area of the country, but it's the same idea that you create a defensible space so that when these fires start, you put them out quickly and you put them out before they get into the wildland-urban interface. And if they happen to get to the wildland-urban interface, that is a defensible area where emergency personnel can go in. And the fire drops down when it runs out of fuel, and that's where you can put it out. That's a long way of talking about the fire sheds and the importance they will have on early detection and early response to get to these fires as soon as possible so that they don't turn into infernos.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to note 55 of our colleagues across the aisle voted for this similar legislation last Congress. I hope more do so this Congress, and I yield the remaining balance of my time to the chairwoman. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Jack. Mr. Roy, you're recognized.
Thank you, Chairwoman. Mr. Westerman, did climate change cause 1 billion acres to be currently under federal control at high risk of fire?
I mean, the lack of management on the on the forest is what causes the risk of fire. But even take the argument that we're getting more fires because we got drier, warmer conditions. If you even accept that argument, then you've got to ask the question, so what do we do about it? And the answer is you manage those forests for the conditions that you're facing. And to say we're not going to manage for whatever reason is the thing about with forestry, no action is an action. If you say we're going to be hands off and we're going to make this a wilderness area and we're going to let nature run its course, nature will run its course, and it can be very violent when it does it.
You know, we have something in hill country. Cedar is invasive and didn't used to be there. It used to be live oak trees, and we had cattle grazing, and then there was some potential some overgrazing. They had to manage that. They had cedar, becomes invasive. Cedar forms the basis of a lot of our fires that we have during drought and in some respects. So a lot of ranchers privately, because we have very little government-owned land in Texas, thank the Lord. And so we have ranchers who are privately going out and cull out that stuff so that you don't have as much fire issue. We still have a ton of it, and we have to do that. But the point is, Mr. Norman referenced the stat of something like 60-something trees per acre a few centuries back, and now 300 trees per acre in California. I think the point here is the purpose of this bill is to manage that issue. Right? We can say whatever we don't want about debating about climate change. That's the point of the bill, the main part, correct?
That's a very good observation on forestry management. We know by soil type, topography, rainfall, all across our country, we know how much growth an acre of land can support. And it's usually stated in basal area, which means the area of the trees. Whether you got 300 trees or 30 trees, that land can only support so much area. And in forests that traditionally were like 60 square feet of basal area per acre or 100 square feet of basal area per acre, we're seeing 300 plus square feet of basal area, and it's not in a few largely spaced or a few far spaced large trees. It's in hundreds of little tiny trees that are growing right up side beside.
Well, I appreciate it. I'm going to yield my time back. I'll just close. We talked a little bit about the disaster supplemental stuff. We ventured in that lane, even though this bill has nothing to do with that. I would just note that, it might surprise folks. I think California should get support irrespective of politics, but it should be limited for all states, it should be limited to FEMA doing the job of triage, help end the crisis, and then get the hell out of the way. But it should not become a blank check. That's true for North Carolina, Georgia, South Carolina, Texas, California. So we should exist, help solve the problem, and then get out of the way. But we can't write blank checks because 1,000 homes got destroyed versus 3. I get a house burns down in my district, but does that guy get a disaster check? Right? Do we get, is it the job of the federal government to come step in and do all that? But 1,000 homes burned down, and then suddenly the government's going to get involved from Washington. California is the 5th biggest economy in the world. Texas is the 8th biggest economy in the world. How about we let states and local and private entities go do what they need to do to go step up? I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Roy. Ms. Fishbach.
I'm sorry, I was expecting Ms. Houchin first, but I'm actually, Mr. Jack, I'm going to bid $1, like on The Price is Right, and I am going to say, so I'm going to win that prize, but I'm going to just thank you for bringing this forward and, familiar with the bill from the last time it was here, and so I appreciate it, and with that, I yield back.
Thank you very much. Ms. Houchin.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Chairman Westerman, thanks for coming to the Rules Committee today and for being here to talk about the Fix Our Forest Act. We've already heard through some of the panel questioning today and your comments that our current law is hindering forest management practices. We've also heard how, had this bill been taken up by the Senate, we passed it in the House last Congress, had this bill been taken up by the Senate and supported by President Biden in the White House in the last Congress, it could have helped mitigate at least some of the risk that we've seen with the wildfires, particularly in California. Chairman Westerman, you're also the only forester in Congress, so you have expertise that really is invaluable for this discussion. So I just want to give you the opportunity to, if you have any additional comments on this bill, its significance for the health and the management of our nation's forests. Any other things you'd like to say before we close out this portion of the hearing?
Thank you, Representative Houchin. And, it takes a long time to do forest management, but we should have started decades ago. And in fact, if you go back and look at fire intensity and the fire frequency back to the 80s and 90s, we've seen an exponential increase in the number of fires and the size of fires. So this didn't happen overnight, and you're not going to fix it overnight. But had the Senate passed the bill last fall, they probably couldn't have gotten the work done. But I did mention the bill we passed several years ago, Representative McClintock's bill, and they did the work at South Lake Tahoe, and it was almost like when they said the project's done, a fire came through, and it paid many times over for the work that was done. Again, there's 44 million homes in the wildland-urban interface. We lost 15,000 homes in this fire, and we've seen the devastation of it. So it's time to get this bill passed, and not just pass the bill, but get the work done.
I think it goes really without saying that our goal here with Fix Our Forests and as we legislate this is to not have problems like what we've seen in California continue into the future through responsible forest management practices.
We need to do the best that we can do with what we've got, and this bill gives our federal land managers the opportunity to do that. Thank you,
Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Madam Chair. I yield back.
Thank you very much. I want to say I was going to bring up the fact that Mr. Westerman is the only forester in the House of Representatives, and how lucky we are to have him. You've given a master class to the Rules Committee today about forest management and the negative things that happen when these fires occur. And I appreciate your emphasizing over and over and over again, with good management, we can minimize these. We absolutely can. And every part of the country is at risk. My part of the country, where there are a lot of trees and there's a lot of U.S. forest land, is very much at risk. And so I wholeheartedly support what you're doing with this bill, and I hope we can pass it and get it signed into law so we don't see disasters like we've seen in California. The American people just weep to see that and what we saw in Hawaii. So thank you both very much. The witnesses are excused.
We can also
Mr. McClintock, would you join us at the table? I welcome our second panel, Representative McClintock and Ranking Member Raskin from the Committee on the Judiciary. Representative McClintock, I welcome your testimony.
Well, thank you, Madam Chairman. S5 bears the name of Laken Riley, murdered by one of the more than 7.8 million illegal aliens that Joe Biden and his Democratic supporters deliberately allowed into our country over the last 4 years. In Laken's case, the murderer was paroled into this country through a shocking abuse of this power. He was repeatedly arrested for theft and other crimes in sanctuary jurisdictions, and each time released back onto our streets. Just months before he murdered Laken, he was arrested for theft. But ICE couldn't take him into custody because of the Biden-Harris administration's policies that shield such monsters from arrest and deportation. This measure, first introduced by Representative Mike Collins here in the House, would require ICE detention for illegal aliens who are charged with, arrested for, or convicted of any burglary, theft, larceny, or shoplifting offense. Now, the Democrats have argued that mere accusation of committing a crime should not be grounds for detention, and besides, shoplifting's no big deal. They ignore the fact that every illegal alien is required to be detained by current law throughout the pendency of their asylum claims. The Democrats thumbed their noses at this law for the last 4 years. Their excuse is that they're prioritizing detaining more dangerous offenders. Well, that's exactly what this bill does, and yet they still oppose it. During his first term, President Trump proved that the president, on his own authority, can secure our borders. He's about to prove that again. President Biden proved that a president who's determined to make a mockery of our immigration laws can willfully open our borders to the most violent criminals and terrorists and gangs and cartels on this planet and use the Democrat sanctuary laws to protect them. This national nightmare ended at noon yesterday. But what of future presidents? This bill assures that what happened to Laken Riley cannot happen again should another Joe Biden disgrace the presidency. Our Senate colleagues have added to the Laken Riley Act parts of Sarah's Law, introduced by Representative Andy Feenstra and Senator Joni Ernst, to mandate detention for illegal aliens who commit any offense that involves death or serious bodily injury. Sarah's Law is named after Sarah Root. On January 31st of 2016, as Sarah drove home after celebrating her college graduation, an illegal alien who was street racing while drunk slammed into her SUV, snapping Sarah's spine and fracturing her skull. Sarah died days later on February 4th. Within hours of her death, a judge set the illegal alien's bond at $50,000 because ICE refused to lodge a detainer as the law requires, despite a desperate request by local police to do so. The administration defended this dereliction of duty, quote, because the illegal alien had not been convicted of a criminal charge and therefore was not an enforcement priority. Well, S5 closes this loophole by requiring detention for illegal aliens like Sarah Root's killer, who are arrested for, charged with, admit to, or are convicted of any crime that resulted in someone's death or serious bodily injury. In addition, this bill includes elements of Representative Jeff Van Drew's Detain and Deport Illegal Aliens Who Assault Cops Act, which passed the House just last year and applies the same mandate for those who assault law enforcement officers. This bill would also allow states to bring a civil action against derelict federal officers who refuse to enforce immigration law. This was first introduced by Representatives Dan Bishop and Chip Roy in the Sue for Immigration Enforcement Act. That bill also passed the House and was also killed by Senate Democrats. Well, whether it is sober reflection or perhaps the sobering results of the November election, a handful of Democrats in both houses and the Senate have come over to support this law, and we welcome them. We wish them well in convincing the majority of their party that they need to change course, if not for the good of our country, then at least for the good of themselves. And we'll take their support any way we can get it. I have every confidence that President Trump will end this scourge upon our nation during the next 4 years. This law and the others that will follow will assure that no future president will be able to unleash upon our country what Joe Biden and his Democratic supporters did. The Judiciary Committee asks this bill be made in order and brought to the floor as soon as possible. I yield back.
Mr. McClintock. Mr. Raskin, you're recognized.
Chairwoman Fox, I'm delighted to see you and congratulations on your new position here in the Rules Committee. That's wonderful news. And I suppose the ranking member now is Ms. Scanlon, if Mr. McGovern's not present yet. Thanks to you and members of the Rules Committee. I suppose I need to say something on behalf of President Biden, because my distinguished colleague just said he disgraced the presidency. The Biden administration brought us back from the pandemic and economic crisis under President Trump in his first term by investing in American workers, American manufacturing, and American infrastructure. President Biden's bottom-up policies for uplifting the working class majority in America instead of the tiny billionaire class worked. Today, our nation's economic strength is, quote, the envy of the world, as The Economist magazine put it, with an unemployment rate of 4.2%, wages rising across America, the GDP growing at a robust 3.1%. Moreover, the murder rate under Democrats came way down. Unlawful immigration at the southern border fell below where it was when Donald Trump left office 4 years ago, and the roaring stock market, which is what the billionaire entourage cares about most, just completed its 2 strongest back-to-back years in a quarter century. So now's the time that we should be getting together, Madam Chair, to increase the minimum wage, to lift children out of poverty, to strengthen unions and collective bargaining, and to expand the middle class. But Donald Trump has assembled an unprecedented billionaire cabinet from the top 0.00003%, drawn from poolside cocktail hour at Mar-a-Lago, so the plutocrats and broligarchs can plunder an even larger share of government contracts for their giant corporations. Donald Trump campaigned on the promise of bringing down the high post-COVID-19 prices of rent, groceries, consumer goods, and health care, prices that his billionaire cabinet knows well because they raised them. But we haven't seen any legislation about that. They don't seem to have any interest in bringing down the cost of living for working people in the country. But if they do, we Democrats are ready to work with them. After all, we dramatically lowered prescription drug prices in Medicare by capping out-of-pocket monthly expenses at $35 a month and annual total out-of-pocket expenditures at $2,000 a year. The mega forces who inhabit the deep pockets of big pharma opposed us every step of the way on that legislation. But if they have good policy proposals now for lowering inflation, which is what they campaigned on, by all means bring them forward. We have repeatedly crossed the aisle to agree to bipartisan compromise, as we did last year when President Biden and Senate Democrats worked with the second most conservative Republican senator, James Lankford, to arrive at a tough bipartisan border security deal. But you'll recall that President Trump and House Republicans tanked the deal, openly preferring the continuation of a border crisis to the development of a border solution, all for nakedly political reasons. Well, today, our friends are advancing to the floor for the second time this month, not their long-awaited policy solution to inflation, but another fundamentally empty and opportunistic immigration measure. It's not like the compromise they tanked in the last Congress, a bill for greater border security, or better technology in ports of entry, or for expanding lawful pathways to immigration and citizenship for millions of people, or for addressing huge immigrant visa backlogs, much less for addressing the underlying conditions of crime, lawlessness, and oppression fueling migration from so many countries in the first place. No, this bill would expand the scope of mandatory immigration detention, going from the compulsory detention of any undocumented immigrant who is convicted of an act of theft, serious violent crime, larceny, or shoplifting, to the compulsory detention of any such person simply charged with, or even just arrested for such an offense, even if they are never charged with or convicted of a criminal offense at all. This is a huge departure from current law, which since 1996 has only required mandatory detention for those who are criminally convicted or who admit to having committed certain crimes. That is, when criminal guilt is certain. It's important to note that the government already, as my friend acknowledges, has discretionary authority to detain any and all undocumented immigrants facing deportation. So this bill would actually take away the executive's discretion to detain those who are most dangerous or most likely to flee. It seems to me strange, Madam Chairwoman, that the majority party is taking this position. Many in the majority do not even believe that the criminal justice system can be trusted when a jury unanimously convicts someone of 34 different felony criminal counts, who's had the best legal representation money can buy in New York State after a painstaking criminal trial with all due process protections and rights afforded. For the majority, criminal arrest, criminal charges and indictment, criminal prosecution, with the defendant enjoying right to some of the best lawyers in the world, with unlimited possibility of cross-examination and the opportunity to introduce whatever evidence the defendant wants, and the requirement of a unanimous jury verdict on the basis of a beyond any reasonable doubt standard of proof is not even enough to give them confidence in the verdict. They still doubt it. But if the criminal justice process cannot be trusted to identify a truly guilty person, even when that person has been arrested, charged, indicted, prosecuted, represented at every stage, given every opportunity to cross-examine and to testify personally, and then is unanimously convicted by a jury of their peers beyond a reasonable doubt, then how can the criminal justice process be trusted to identify a truly guilty person with a simple arrest, with no indictment, no prosecution, no cross-examination, no neutral adjudication under an impartial judge, no fact-finding, no criminal conviction by a unanimous 12-person jury beyond a reasonable doubt? Their legislation proposes to impose mandatory immigration detention on people who've been arrested but never charged with, prosecuted for, or convicted of any crime at all. They could be arrested and have had their charges dismissed for lack of evidence and still be subjected to mandatory immigration detention. Under this bill, a young person with DACA or TPS status who's falsely accused of shoplifting because she's with a group of friends where one person is arrested for it will be subject to mandatory immigration detention. This could be a young person who's been in America lawfully for decades with his or her family. Is that what we really want to do? Mandatory detention has long been reserved for people who actually commit serious criminal offenses. Expanding the requirement to include every person who's been merely accused of or arrested for, but then not charged with shoplifting or other offenses, collapses the distinction between conviction and simply being charged or arrested for something. Moreover, Congress has never even appropriated enough money to detain all non-citizens who fall under the currently serious mandatory detention categories. Since passage in the House earlier this month, the Department of Homeland Security estimates that this bill will cost at least $26 billion in the first year alone to enact, with the total cost coming at a minimum of $83 billion. For context, the current entire DHS budget is $62 billion. This is an unfunded mandate for a mass roundup of people without any regard to American due process. The bill also seeks to give state governments authority and control over the federal immigration system by trespassing on the Article II executive power in a way that 8 Supreme Court justices completely repudiated just 2 years ago as a blatant violation of the separation of powers. The idea here is to give state attorneys general precisely what the Supreme Court denied: legal standing to sue the federal government in court for perceived violations of the Immigration and Nationality Act, so states can block federal immigration policies, totally capsizing the Supremacy Clause and expanding judicial power to encroach upon areas of traditionally complete executive discretion. In June of 2023, the Supreme Court in U.S. versus Texas emphatically rejected the alleged standing of states to sue the federal government to alter its immigration arrest policies. This bill now attempts a legislative bypass of the decision in U.S. versus Texas, written by Justice Kavanaugh and joined by 8 justices on the court. In rejecting the state's standing argument, the court noted, among other things, that lawsuits alleging insufficient arrests or prosecution run against the executive branch's exclusive Article II authority to enforce the law, which includes the discretion to determine enforcement priorities and methods in the face of a chronic lack of resources and shifting public safety needs. If this bill were to become law, both provisions would have the perverse effect of undermining the government's efforts to prioritize the detention and deportation of the most dangerous convicted felons. With the vastly expanded new statutory scope and new authority for states to get this standing on steroids, the government can be sued by a state for not detaining everyone charged with or even arrest for the pettiest of crimes. The Supreme Court has repeatedly noted the importance of standing and upholding our system of separated powers, observing in Raines versus Byrd that no principle is more fundamental to the judiciary's proper role in our system of government than the constitutional limitation of federal court jurisdiction to actual cases or controversies. This is very salient in the immigration context, where the executive branch must exercise its discretion under authority to enforce immigration law because of limited resources and the consequences such decisions may have on its primary role over foreign policy and commerce. Yet this bill tries to give states standing to sue for harms as small as $100, dramatically shifting power from the executive branch to the judiciary and the federal government to the states in constitutionally dubious ways. Because this bill now appears to be on a glide path to passage, Steve Bannon is boasting about how he plans to work with MAGA state attorneys general to exploit a provision in the bill to sue to stop the federal government from issuing any visas to entire countries deemed uncooperative, such as India. This could significantly harm our legal immigration system and will have massive foreign policy implications. As you know, visas are part and parcel of complex reciprocal relationships involving trade, U.S. citizen access to foreign visas, economic exchanges, and national security and intelligence cooperation. Like many of the immigration-related bills the GOP is advancing today, this one follows a simple strategy. Pick a crime, any crime, then paste it into a template immigration law already covering convicted criminals, but then require detention or deport of certain persons merely accused of committing the crime. No due process required at all.
Mr. Raskin.
Yes.
You have now spoken for 12 minutes and 20 seconds.
Is there a limit now in the Rules Committee?
There is not an official time.
I'm on my last paragraph.
But we are urging people, please. Well, I would like to finish this.
If you had told me in advance, I would have had it down to 5 minutes. I cut it down from 25 to 12. Okay. So I didn't know that there were new time limits in rules.
Well, we're just urging people so that we can complete our work before we have to go.
You set the rules. I will comply with the rules,
okay.
Ms. Fox.
Well, if you could we're happy to have your printed
Good.
statement.
I'm on my last paragraph. If you don't mind, I will do that just to round it out. Today, you're asked to vote to advance a constitutionally dubious bill that fails to address any of the real problems of our broken immigration system, but requires the mandatory detention and deportation of people simply accused of a crime, just accused of it, even if they turn out to be innocent, even if the charges are completely dropped. And we are procedurally foreclosed from offering any amendments to improve this radical and sloppy product. I urge my colleagues to oppose this, and I yield back to you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Raskin. Representative McClintock, thank you for being here today. Would you like to respond to anything the ranking member said in his long remarks?
Well, let me mention a couple of things. He says, well, this doesn't require a conviction. Well, he forgets that current law requires every single illegal alien in this country to be detained during the entire pendency of their asylum claims. That is the current law. This is the law that they have studiously ignored for the last 4 years. And now they're saying, ignore the law even if that illegal alien has been charged with committing other crimes as well. Let them back on the streets. Let them continue to prey on innocent Americans like Laken Riley. And if a few innocent teens end up getting raped or murdered along the way, that's just too bad. With respect to the constitutionality of the measure, this is what the Kavanaugh Court actually did. The standing provisions in the Laken Riley Act actually give the states the ability to challenge it in court in future open borders administrations that refuse to follow the law as written by Congress. This bill follows the path that was laid out by Justice Kavanaugh in his majority opinion in United States versus Texas. In that opinion, he stated, quote, the standing analysis might differ when Congress elevates de facto injuries to the status of legally cognizable injuries redressable by a federal court. For example, Kavanaugh continues, Congress might, one, specifically authorize suits against the executive branch by a defined set of plaintiffs who have suffered concrete harms from executive under-enforcement, and two, specifically authorize the judiciary to enter appropriate orders requiring additional arrests or prosecutions by the executive branch. Well, that's exactly what this bill does. It allows state officials to sue open border administration officials for their lack of enforcement of immigration law if those legal violations harm the state or its residents. This provision will help ensure that the American people never again have to suffer under the open borders policies like we experienced over the last 4 years. So this bill does exactly what Justice Kavanaugh said Congress needs to do in order to repair this problem.
Thank you, Mr. McClintock. Can you respond to claims that this legislation would not have prevented the senseless murder of Laken Riley?
On the contrary, Laken Riley's killer was arrested multiple times and released multiple times in sanctuary jurisdictions. This measure would have put a stop to that, and and Laken Riley and so many other. This is a tale that is told over and over again. We don't know exactly how many of these criminals, among the 7.8 million this administration allowed into our country, are out there right now. Unfortunately, we're finding out slowly tragedy by horrific tragedy. And I've asked, how many more bills do we have to attach the names of these victims to before the Democrats will actually will join us to protect the American people from the violence that they've unleashed upon us?
Thank you, Mr. McClintock. Ms. Scanlon, you're recognized.
Thank you. This is hardly the first time we've considered this bill. It seems like it's before us in some form or another every other week. But it continues to not do anything to secure our borders or reform our immigration system. What it continues to do is exploit a young woman's tragic death to score cheap and grossly misleading political points. It's long been the law in this country to detain and deport undocumented immigrants who are convicted of serious crimes, including rape and murder. But that is not what this bill does. This bill says if an undocumented immigrant is ever arrested, not convicted, just accused, not even charged with shoplifting, theft, or other crimes, they must be detained or jailed. And although this mandatory detention is estimated to cost at least $26 billion in the first year and over $80 billion thereafter, the bill doesn't provide any extra money for enforcement. In addition, it does open the door to lawsuits by individual states' attorney general against the federal government to block immigration laws and undermine our federal system, the federal courts, and even international relations with other countries. This is an opportunity that has not received much attention, but which our colleague Mr. Roy has said is the part of the bill that has the most force, stating this bill would lose 90% of its luster if that were taken out. So the Laken Riley Act is just bad legislation. It doesn't make Americans safer. It doesn't improve enforcement of existing laws. And it opens the door to abuse of both our criminal justice system and our federal system. It doesn't do what its proponents claim that it does. But I submit that is not the real goal of this or any of the other immigration bills that Republicans are championing while they have control of Congress. Instead, they're prioritizing exploiting the broken immigration system to make political arguments. So just to be clear, a vote against this bill is not a vote against detention or deportation of people who've committed a serious crime, but it is a vote against a radical and expensive bill that doesn't solve the actual problems that we face. Mr. Raskin, do you have anything to add here? I think it's particularly interesting that this piece about the states being able to block federal legislation, federal policies, is viewed as the most important part of the bill by some of our conservative colleagues.
I think you summarized the situation very well, Congresswoman Scanlon. To begin with, this doesn't address any of the immigration problems in the country, and to do that would require the kind of bipartisan compromise that we had at the end of the last Congress that Donald Trump blew up. And I wish we were getting together on a bipartisan basis right now to hammer out a serious, meaningful compromise at toughening up the border and creating lawful pathways to citizenship for the Dreamers, for the DACA kids. That's something that would be meaningful on the immigration side. In terms of public safety, security side, I would love to have that debate with our colleagues because we have the highest rate of gun violence and gun death in the industrialized world. Nothing even comes close. And we could name not a handful, but thousands of bills after all of the victims of gun violence from Sandy Hook, Connecticut, to the Marjorie Stoneman Douglas School in Florida, to El Paso, Texas, to Buffalo, to the Amish school shooting. I mean, you name it. We could just keep going. We could name them after people every day. But at that point, the reservoir of compassion and emotional concern on the other side of the aisle dries up. They don't seem to feel it in the same way. They want to assert a constitutional principle, which the Supreme Court has never found, which is that there's somehow a right for U.S. citizens to possess weapons of war on the streets of America. What we really need is a ban on AR-15s and military-style assault weapons in America if you want to get serious about saving people's lives. And that's whether the AR-15s are wielded by U.S. citizens or undocumented aliens or people on other kinds of legal immigration status. It's those weapons are a major danger, as well as not having a universal violent criminal background check, which is supported by more than 90% of the people. So if we were serious about public safety or immigration, we would be addressing those issues in serious ways. Now, as to your final point about standing, this legislation's authorization of a cause of action is neither specific nor does it identify particular plaintiffs as called for by the Supreme Court decision. It's the near opposite. Almost any state or person could sue for nearly any claimed harm at all, regardless of whether it's traceable to specific federal immigration enforcement action or not. So this is just basically giving the keys to the federal court and the keys to federal immigration policy to state attorneys general because somebody happens to like a few of the attorney generals today.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I mean, the problem with a lot of these messaging bills is that the devil is in the details. It's our job to read the fine print and call it out when that fine print is actually harmful. So I appreciate your expertise in this area. I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Scanlon. Mr. Norman, you're recognized. Ms. Leisure-Fernandez, you're recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. We should absolutely hold accountable immigrants and everybody when they commit a crime, especially when it's against a law enforcement officer. Especially when it's against a law enforcement officer. And we had 140 Capitol Police end up in the hospital. Some died because they were beaten in this building. They have now been pardoned. Shame. Shame. We are concerned about attacks on law enforcement. We should be denouncing the pardons of those who attacked the people who protect us in this building. Oh, did you want to?
Well, I agree very strongly with what you just said, Ms. Leisure-Fernandez. We were, I think all of us were here on that day where those police officers risked their lives, their limbs, their ability to be with their families ever again to save us, to save the Vice President of the United States as a violent mob chanted, "Hang Mike Pence, hang Mike Pence," and chased us out of the House chamber and the Senate chamber. I think it's scandalous that people who would smash police officers over the head with baseball bats, hockey sticks, Confederate battle flags, and so on, would be pardoned without any statement that they've been reformed or rehabilitated and no longer constitute a threat to public safety and to the members of Congress, our staffs, and the people who work here. So I agree with that completely. Those are people who had every element of due process. They were indicted, they were prosecuted, they had the right to introduce evidence, they had the right to cross-examine witnesses, they were convicted unanimously by a jury of their peers, or in the case of most of them, they pled guilty to their offenses because they were caught on tape, oftentimes by other insurrectionists who caught them on tape. So those people were definitely guilty, and yet there's still people who say that somehow the criminal justice system is unfair. And now, I think, just to score political points, there's an effort to put legislation through which would not even require that modicum of due process, leading all the way up to conviction, but would simply say if somebody is arrested or charged with a minor offense, even if the charges are dropped, even if the arrest is nullified, I don't understand the discordance in approach to our criminal justice system.
Right. And with regards to immigrants who commit these crimes, just once again restating, there is already a process to hold them accountable, to convict them, to deport them. That's already in the law, correct?
That has been in the law since 1996. It has been a strong bipartisan consensus that anybody who is in the country as an undocumented or a documented immigrant, and even someone here with legal status who commits a serious offense is subject to mandatory detention and deportation, and they should be.
Yeah, so that's the law. I want to talk a little bit about some of the maybe intended consequences, because this is the second bill that we are seeing here, which could have very negative consequences for immigrant women. And let me tell you a story. There was an immigrant woman who showed up in an emergency room because she had been beaten so severely by her partner that she ended up in the hospital. But she was terrified because she had been told by her abuser that if she said anything, he would make sure she got deported. And under the bill we passed last week, which was about the Violence Against Women Act, brought by Republicans who voted against the Violence Against Women Act, but they brought a bill with that title. That immigrant woman would be subject to deportation. Looking at this bill here, her abuser would have to do nothing more than accuse her of maybe hitting him back. And if she were arrested but never charged and never tried for that crime, she could be incarcerated and deported. Is that what would happen here?
That's exactly what would happen, and that's why 200 domestic violence groups have written to every member of Congress, Republicans and Democrats alike, to say, please don't do this. That bill is going to harm the victims of domestic violence. You're doing it in the name of the victims, but you're going to injure them and expose them to more violence and control by their abuser.
Right, and these are the concerns, it's these consequences that this bill does not consider. Because that's, if it's just an arrest, right, you go up and this woman who presented, she had been beaten so bad that despite her fear and the threats from her abuser, and she was worried about losing her children, she needed hospital care. And this bill, all he had to do was the threat, have an arrest made, and she'd be gone. And that is scary. And I think that that's what we need to recognize when we look at these bills and we are worried about what would happen. And I know that my colleague from Pennsylvania would like to speak to this.
Yeah, I just wanted to reaffirm what my colleague from New Mexico said. Having worked with legal aid providers for decades, we see this time and time again where the victim of abuse then becomes accused by the abuser and ends up with convictions and thus pitchforked into this situation. So it's not some rare thing. It happens all the time, and it's just one of the ways in which the system that's being pushed here gets perverted.
Yeah, but I would just add to what you've said is that our criminal justice system and our civil systems like immigration have always organized around the distinction between a criminal conviction and everything else. And I'm sure I know my friend Chip Roy is somebody who's very attuned to people's constitutional rights. We would not want to let this certainly slide over to the realm of citizens, that if a citizen is simply arrested or charged with something, they can suddenly start losing their rights, whether we're talking about voting rights or gun rights or anything else. We've always held very fast to the distinction between what is a criminal conviction and what is an arrest or charges, for the reasons that the gentleladies are saying, which is that people can be charged with a lot of things and people can be arrested for a lot of things, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they committed an offense, and that's what due process is all about.
There's a sense of fairness in making sure that when somebody is falsely accused and then, an arrest can be made without malintent by the law enforcement. They are operating on an accusation that was made. We'll make the arrest. We'll realize that there are no grounds for that arrest, and that'll be the end of it.
Well, in a lot of places, they will have to charge someone if there's an accusation of domestic violence,
right,
or they routinely will charge someone.
Right, and so
in a lot of these cases, the woman slaps the abuser or scratches the abuser, or in one case we saw bit the ear of the abuser. And then the abuser files charges with the police or says, she hit me, she started it, she hit me. And so now there are charges against her, and then suddenly she's on the road to deportation.
Right, and I think that there are these things, and that's why convictions are important. That's why the next step is very important. I think it is also worrisome when we are giving states AGs the right to basically determine our immigration policy and determine our visa policy and determine so much of our international policy. But with that, unless there's anything else you would like to add, Ranking Member Raskin, with that, I will yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Leisure-Fernandez. Mr. Langworthy, you're recognized.
Thank you very much, Madam Chairwoman. Representative McClintock, you point out an important piece of this bill is the provision that would allow states standing to bring civil cases against the federal government for failure to enforce immigration laws. What impact will this have on possible future open borders administration like the one the American people have just endured that refuses to enforce federal immigration laws?
Well, it'll simply assure that the law is enforced. And I might point out the standing provisions under this bill don't undo the will of Congress. They give states the standing to sue the federal government when it itself refuses to enforce immigration laws that the Congress has mandated. By ignoring the clear statutory mandates for the detention of illegal aliens, the Biden-Harris administration reversed the will of Congress, as is clearly outlined in statute. This bill simply says that those who are already under current law required to be detained, that is, every person who's entered the country illegally, they have to be detained under current law while their asylum claim is being heard. This bill simply says if you've got an administration like the last one that's ignoring this law, and that same alien who's supposed to be in custody anyway is then arrested for committing other crimes against the American people, or for that matter against the immigrant community itself, they have to be detained. They're end of discussion, end of excuses. And I might also point out that it is the immigrant community that is the most at risk from these criminals, because they prey upon the people that they are associated with. So to say that somehow this is anti-immigrant, quite the contrary, that this assures the safety of the immigrant and native communities combined by getting dangerous people off the streets who should be in custody anyway.
Well, thank you.
And I agree with Mr. Raskin. The violence in this country is absolutely appalling, and I would offer this modest proposal that maybe we ought to remove dangerous criminals from our streets in response to the violence that we're seeing in those streets, particularly in Democratic-run cities that refuse to prosecute the criminals in their midst and, in fact, protect the criminals who are illegal aliens through their sanctuary laws. This bill is a step toward taking back our streets from the violent predators who have been preying on us.
Hear, hear. Thank you. Now, as the sole New Yorker on this dais, but this is not strange to you, Mr. McClintock, as a Californian, I need to also raise the issue of sanctuary jurisdictions and the serious life-threatening damage that they have done to our communities. What role have sanctuary jurisdictions played in shielding illegal aliens who commit crimes like the murder of Laken Riley from being detained by immigration and customs enforcement and deported from our country?
Huge. Again, Laken Riley's killer was not convicted of theft. He was arrested for theft. Under this law, he would have been placed in custody as an illegal alien during the pendency of his asylum claims. What the Democrats are arguing is he should have been released. That's what the Democrats did. They had him released. And Laken Riley is dead as a result of that decision. We need to be clear what the sanctuary laws say. They say that when local authorities have a criminal illegal alien in custody, where that criminal is disarmed, instead of obeying federal law and notifying ICE so that they can be kept in custody until removed, that criminal is instead released right back into our communities. That was true of Laken Riley's killer. It was true of Jocelyn Nungary's killer. It was true of Sarah Root's killer. And so many others whose names we haven't attached yet to legislation, but who are just as dead and whose deaths were just as preventable. And now, under these sanctuary laws, law enforcement has to confront them when they are, not when they're unarmed and in custody, but rather when they are armed and at large after committing other heinous crimes. This is absolutely insane. And what mystifies me is that the Democrats would support sanctuary policies that shield criminal illegals from deportation and instead release them back into our communities to prey upon not only Americans, but as I said, upon the immigrant communities from which they come. You know, they say these sanctuary laws protect the immigrant community. There's no proof of that whatsoever. Indeed, an illegal immigrant family staying at the Roosevelt Hotel in New York City is far more likely to be victimized by these criminals and gangs than those who live perhaps in Scarsdale. Sanctuary laws do not protect the immigrant community. They protect those who are most likely to prey upon the immigrant community and, by the way, prey upon the rest of us as well.
And I just have to add that Laken's killer, you know, he came to New York because there's the bright beacon of the sanctuary city laws in New York City that has been an attractant to this criminal element. And because of our ridiculous cashless bail system, he walked the streets right after he committed a crime and was able to go on to Georgia. And Laken would be alive today if we didn't have those laws in place in New York. And that is just, you know, just devastating that it is just the wrong-headed policies that have taken us in this direction. I want to thank you, Representative McClintock, and I'll just finish my time here by reminding my colleagues that the American people voted for change in November. And that change included abandoning these asinine, life-threatening open borders policies promoted by the Biden administration. They voted for a president and a Congress who would work together to not only uphold our federal immigration laws, but to also hold jurisdictions accountable for providing so-called sanctuaries to those who break our laws when they come to our country, and to those who commit horrific crimes while residing here illegally. I am a proud co-sponsor of this legislation. I look forward to sending this bill to the President's desk later this week with the rest of my colleagues. And with that, Madam Chairwoman, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Langworthy. Mr. McGovern, you're recognized.
Yeah, I don't want to take up very much time. I just want to say that I don't want to be lectured about law and order from Republicans, especially on this day. But Mr. Raskin, I think wanted to respond, and I think that's an appropriate thing to do so that this doesn't just turn into a series of sound bites. So I don't know if you want to have anything to add. If you don't, that's fine. But if you do.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. McGovern. Just a couple of quick points. One is that the killer that we're talking about would not be held even under the new law because he was never arrested. he was treated in Georgia, under Georgia's law, with a citation for misdemeanor shoplifting, but he was never arrested. And that's why there was no ICE 287G check done on him. He would have been identified and likely removed, according to the Athens-Clarke County Police Department, had that been done. But he was never arrested, and he wouldn't be arrested he would not be covered under this legislation. So it strikes me as just off point. But the gentleman was talking about the dangerous criminals that have been let loose in the land, and I think there are more than 1,000 dangerous criminals who were let loose last night who are in Washington, D.C. or around the country. I don't know that any of them are non-citizens. I think most of them are U.S. citizens, but that doesn't make us feel any better. So that is a soft on crime, soft on violent crime policy that was embarked upon the very first day of the new administration. So I suppose I'm with the ranking member in saying this is a particularly bad day for anybody on that side of the aisle to get up and purport to lecture us on public safety when there are Proud Boys, Oath Keepers, members of the Ku Klux Klan, 3%ers, and other marauders and insurrectionists who've been set loose without any guarantee that they won't engage in violent action again, either against public institutions or police officers. One quick correction to Ms. Leisure-Fernandez. It was not 140 Capitol Police officers who were wounded, injured, and hospitalized. It was 80, and then there were 60 from the Metropolitan Police Department, and there were police officers from other surrounding jurisdictions, including Montgomery County, Maryland, who came to defend us against the mob attack on January 6th. Thank you, Mr. McGovern.
Madam Chair.
Staff just gave him something, so I'll yield to him to...
Just to correct the record, ICE has said that Ibarra was arrested in New York City in September 2023 and was charged with acting in a manner to injure a child less than 17 and a motor vehicle license violation. So he was arrested.
We're referring to two different incidents. Okay.
Okay, but for being just let out, even though he was endangering the welfare of a child in the state of New York and let to go to Georgia, he would have been detained.
Correct.
And under this, he would be detained.
Correct.
So thank you, and I yield back.
Well, if I might respond to you, Mr. Langworthy, I appreciate that. If there are any crimes that are committed, violent or otherwise, by the more than 1,000 people who were released from jail yesterday, would you then say that Donald Trump is responsible for what they're doing? Well, that follows from your logic.
Not even, absolutely not entering this rhetorical question. People that have entered this country illegally and commit crimes should be removed from the country, period, end of story.
I thought you were talking about release from criminal custody.
I would just, thank you very much. Again, without belaboring this point, but the reality is that the people that were released yesterday, I mean, one of the things that they can now do is go out and buy weapons. And one of them just tweeted that grateful for the pardon, he's now going out to buy a bunch of effing weapons. So again, you all own this. You all own this. I yield back.
Mr. Scott, you're recognized.
Madam Chair, I would just like to give credit to my friend Mike Collins for his work on the legislation. And I would, again, you know, I hate that Laken Riley is not with us. I think her parents, in their grief, have found comfort in that the legacy of their daughter is going to go on, and hopefully this won't happen. What happened to her won't happen to some other people. And I look forward to voting for this piece of legislation. And to be honest with you, I wish it went further. With that, I yield.
Thank you, Mr. Scott. Mr. Griffith, you're recognized.
Let me echo the comments of Mr. Scott. He did a nice job. Mr. Langworthy's done a nice job. I am proud to support this bill, and I yield back.
Mr. Roy, you're recognized.
I'll try to be mindful of time. I know we want to try to get this done and vote. I would just note, as one of the original authors of the Sue Act portion of this bill, it does have specificity with respect to targeting parole abuses, detention releases is pretty specific in what it's trying to target to ensure that the attorneys general of states, like the state of Texas, who are faced with a recalcitrant federal government refusing to secure the border, have some recourse. And it's pretty actually specific in laying that out and why. And I would note, last night I was able to attend one of the balls, and one of my guests was Alexis Nungare. And Alexis came with her husband. Alexis testified in front of the Judiciary Committee last summer. She turned 28 just recently. She lost her 13-year-old daughter last July. Absolutely lovely woman. Chose life when she was a 14-year-old. Was raising Jocelyn. Jocelyn was murdered by members of a Venezuelan gang. They were very specifically released into our country by the Biden administration. There are example after example after example of this. So this bill would address that. It would address that with respect to the state of Texas having had recourse when the federal government was failing to do its job. That's what this bill would do. It is a fundamentally important resetting of the balance so that states no longer will ever have to tolerate what we've been tolerating for the last 4 years. There is no possible way to explain the extent to which the people that I represent, the people across this country, like Alexis last night, who went out as a non-political young woman in her 20s, a simple mom of a 13-year-old girl, and she went and put her in her bed, and then she wasn't there anymore. And Alexis got out and started campaigning. Went on the stage with Senator Cruz, President Trump. Why? Because she didn't want that to happen to anybody else. Alexis is Hispanic by heritage. Parents are immigrants. I think generations back, depending on which side of the family you want to talk about. Never, in her own words, sitting at the table in the back conference room at the Judiciary Committee, said family never asked for anything, never wanted any benefits, government programs. They just wanted the ability to work in this country. And, I was honored to have her with me last night. I took her there because I felt bad she couldn't go to the inauguration. Obviously, we had indoors. I bring that up because it matters. I mean, we were sitting there taking it on the chin as the people of the state of Texas and other people around the country. It wasn't just Texas, Maryland, Rachel Marin right here in Maryland, Laken Riley here in Georgia. And so this bill would set out to address that problem while also then addressing the problem that we simply want to detain. And to the gentleman from Maryland, I would say, look, it's not shocking that we have situations where American citizens are afforded due process, but that due process is recognized to mean that I can be detained if I'm charged with a crime. I can be detained without bail. I can be detained and not released as a citizen. As the gentleman knows, and as we're all aware, there's nothing earth-shattering about that. I can't recall. The professor will know better than I because I haven't studied it for a while. But I think, what was it, the Bail Reform Act or whatever, had a couple different provisions in it, one of which was danger to society, the other of which was the likelihood you might not show up. And I'm just kind of thinking that maybe the fact that you're here illegally might fit in squarely into the idea that we might not believe you'll show up. And that's what you apply to American citizens. So from my standpoint, the idea that we've got legislation that is simply laying out a process by which we can detain people who are here illegally and have ICE put a detainer on them, working with local law enforcement, and say, you know what, there's going to be times in a future administration when you want to try to not detain them, very specifically, that we're going to say we're going to detain and provide greater tools and greater requirements that we detain people who are here illegally. And yes, sometimes it's based on charges. Because at some point in the balancing of interest, if you're here illegally and you're charged with a crime, and no doubt occasionally someone's charged with a crime who's here illegally who should not have been. That happens. But you're charged with a crime, I think we should look out for the interest and balance the interests of the citizens who might be at risk, particularly when an administration is so flouted the law and common sense to have released millions at any one time, including, yes, very dangerous individuals. So with that, I will yield back to the chairwoman.
Thank you, Mr. Roy. Mr. Jack, you're recognized.
I'll just first applaud Mr. Roy for sharing that story. I'm very familiar with that story. I'm glad it's entered into the record. And I just want to also concur with Mr. Scott, the dean of our delegation, in applauding Mr. Collins for sponsoring this legislation. His father served in Congress and represented my congressional district many years ago, and I think that he does great justice to Laken Riley and all of the people in Georgia and our country by advancing this legislation and earning significant bipartisan support for this bill in our House and likewise as we've seen in the Senate. And with that, I yield back.
Thank you very much, Ms. Fishbone.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just want to associate myself with the remarks of this side of the dais. I appreciate the passion and information, and it is. I'm a co-sponsor of this bill, and it is just critical that we do this to protect our women, our children, our society, and our individuals, because crime is out of control, and this is one thing that we can do to help to get make sure that those people responsible are being sent out of our country. And so I appreciate that, and I'm not asking the question, it's simply a rhetorical question, but as we talk about President Trump's pardon of the J6 individuals, what about the thousands of criminals that Mr. Biden pardoned on his way out the door? We're not talking about those. And is he going to be responsible for every single, if one of them reoffend, your question to Mr. Langworthy? And I think...
Are you asking me?
No, I said it was rhetorical. I was very, very, very clear. And I just, let's actually talk about the facts instead of the sound bites that I hear from the other side. And with that, I yield back, Madam Chair.
Thank you, everyone. I am about to close the hearing portion of and the chair will be in receipt of a motion. Pardon me. Yeah. Okay. This closes the hearing portion. The chair will be in the receipt of a motion from the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Scott.
Madam Chair, I move the committee grant H.R. 471, the Fix Our Forests Act, a structured rule. The rule waives all points of order against consideration of the bill. The rule provides 1 hour of general debate, equally divided and controlled by the chair and ranking minority member of the Committee on Natural Resources or their respective designees. The rule provides that the bill shall be considered as read. The rule waives all points of order against provisions in the bill. The rule makes in order only those amendments printed in the Rules Committee report. Each amendment may be offered only in the order printed in the report, may be offered only by a member designated in the report, shall be considered as read, shall be debatable for the time specified in the report, equally divided and controlled by the proponent and an opponent, shall not be subject to amendment, and shall not be subject to a demand for division of the question. All points of order against the amendments printed in the report are waived. The rule provides one motion to recommit. The rule further provides for consideration of S5, the Laken Riley Act, under a closed rule. The rule waives all points of order against consideration of the bill. The rule provides that the bill shall be considered as read. The rule waives all points of order against provisions in the bill. The rule provides 1 hour of general debate, equally divided and controlled by the chair and ranking minority member of the Committee on the Judiciary or their respective designees. Finally, the rule provides one motion to commit.
Thank you very much. You've now heard the motion. Is there any discussion or amendment to the rule?
Yes, Madam Chair. Madam Chairwoman, I have an amendment to the rule. I move the committee make an order amendment number 2 to H.R. 471 offered by Mr. Neguse of Colorado, which inserts the updated text of the Tim Hart Wildland Firefighter Classification and Pay Parity Act to improve pay and benefits for the federal wildland firefighters.
Does anyone else wish to speak on Mr. McGovern's amendment? Hearing no comments to questions on the amendment, all those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
All those opposed, no.
No.
The amendment is not agreed to.
I ask for a roll call because I believe they deserve this
The clerk will call the roll.
Mrs. Fishbach? No. Mrs. Fishbach, no. Mr. Norman? No. Mr. Norman, no. Mr. Roy? No. Mr. Roy, no. Mrs. Houchin? No. Mrs. Houchin, no. Mr. Langworthy?
No.
Mr. Langworthy, no. Mr. Scott?
No.
Mr. Scott, no. Mr. Griffith?
No.
Mr. Griffith, no. Mr. Jack?
No.
Mr. Jack, no. Mr. McGovern?
Aye.
Mr. McGovern, aye. Ms. Scanlon? Aye. Ms. Scanlon, aye. Mr. Neguse? Ms. Ledger-Fernandez? Aye. Ms. Ledger-Fernandez, aye. Madam Chair?
No.
Madam Chair, no.
The clerk will report the total.
3 yeas, 9 nays.
The noes have it. The amendment is not agreed to. Are there other amendments?
Madam Chair.
Ms. Ledger-Fernandez.
Madam Chairwoman, I have an amendment to the rule. I move the committee make an order amendment number 7 to H.R. 471, offered by myself. Amendment number 7 would insert authorizations for appropriations for activities in various sections of the bill. It just doesn't make sense to recognize all of the work, some of which I agree with, in Fix Our Forest, but not provide even an authorization for the money it would take to actually fix our forest. It takes people to manage a forest, which means you have to pay those people. So it's not because of community input or endangered species that we are not treating the acres that need to be treated. It's because the Forest Service simply does not have the resources it needs to meet its forest management goals. I urge my colleagues to vote in favor of my amendment so that the Forest Service has the resources it needs to keep our communities safe. And with that, I yield back.
Does anyone else wish to speak on the amendment by Ms. Ledger-Fernandez? Hearing no other further comments, the question's on the amendment. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, no. No. In the opinion of chair, the noes have it. The amendment's not agreed to.
Madam Chairwoman, I request you record the vote.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mrs. Fishbach? No. Mrs. Fishbach, no. Mr. Norman?
No.
Mr. Norman, no. Mr. Roy?
No.
Mr. Roy, no. Mrs. Houchin? No. Mrs. Houchin, no. Mr. Langworthy?
No.
Mr. Langworthy, no. Mr. Scott?
No.
Mr. Scott, no. Mr. Griffith?
No.
Mr. Griffith, no. Mr. Jack?
No.
Mr. Jack, no. Mr. McGovern? Mr. McGovern, aye. Ms. Scanlon? Aye. Ms. Scanlon, aye. Mr. Neguse? Ms. Ledger-Fernandez?
Aye.
Ms. Ledger-Fernandez, aye. Madam Chair?
No.
Madam Chair, no.
The clerk will report the total.
3 yeas, 9 nays.
The noes have it. The amendment is not agreed to.
Madam Chair.
Yes, ma'am.
Madam Chairwoman, I have an amendment to the rule and move the committee make an order amendment number 8 to H.R. 471 offered by myself. Amendment number 8 would actually include in the bill the Seedlings for Sustainable Habitat Restoration, which passed by unanimous consent out of the House Natural Resources Committee last Congress. Similar to Representative Neguse's bill, there were many amendments to this bill that were actually, or that could have been included in here, which were bipartisan, approved by the committee. The idea of having closed rules where we are not able to offer amendments that are bipartisan and could pass the floor, I think is misplaced. It would be great to have the debate on the floor on these wide range of amendments. And with that, I urge my colleagues to vote in favor of my amendment, and I yield back.
Thank you. Does anyone else wish to speak on the amendment? If not, the question is on the amendment. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed say nay. No. Nay. In the opinion chair, the noes have it. The amendment is not agreed to. The gentlewoman requests a recorded vote. The clerk will call the roll.
Mrs. Fishbach? No. Mrs. Fishbach, no. Mr. Norman? No. Mr. Norman, no. Mr. Roy?
No.
Mr. Roy, no. Mrs. Houchin? No. Mrs. Houchin, no. Mr. Langworthy? No. Mr. Langworthy, no. Mr. Scott? No. Mr. Scott, no. Mr. Griffith?
No.
Mr. Griffith, no. Mr. Jack?
No.
Mr. Jack, no. Mr. McGovern?
Aye.
Mr. McGovern, aye. Ms. Scanlon? Aye. Ms. Scanlon, aye. Mr. Neguse? Ms. Ledger-Fernandez? Aye. Ms. Ledger-Fernandez, aye. Madam Chair?
No.
Madam Chair, no.
The clerk will report the total.
3 yeas, 9 nays.
The noes have it. The amendment is not agreed to. Are there other amendments? Hearing no further discussion, the question is on the motion from the gentleman from Georgia. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed say no.
No.
In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The motion is agreed
Ask for a
to.
roll call, Madam Chair.
A recorded vote has been requested. The clerk will call the roll.
Mrs. Fishbach?
Yes.
Mrs. Fishbach, aye. Mr. Norman? Aye. Mr. Norman, aye. Mr. Roy?
Aye.
Mr. Roy, aye. Mrs. Houchin? Aye. Mrs. Houchin, aye. Mr. Langworthy? Aye. Mr. Langworthy, aye. Mr. Scott? Aye. Mr. Scott, aye. Mr. Griffith?
Aye.
Mr. Griffith, aye. Mr. Jack?
Aye.
Mr. Jack, aye. Mr. McGovern?
No.
Mr. McGovern, no. Ms. Scanlon?
No.
Ms. Scanlon, no. Mr. Neguse? Ms. Ledger-Fernandez? Ms. Ledger-Fernandez, no. Madam Chair?
Aye.
Madam Chair, aye.
The clerk will report the total.
9 yeas, 3 nays.
And the ayes have it. The motion to report is agreed to. Accordingly, Mr. Scott will be managing this rule for the majority.
And I will do it for the minority.
Thank you, Mr. McGovern. And I thank everyone for coming today. We had great attendance and great attention to the time. So I appreciate that very much. Without objection, the committee is adjourned.
On Wednesday, Office of Management and Budget nominee Russell